she found her answer. A Bene Gesserit could see it, but she doubted even the Emperor's financial advisers or Choam accountants would detect the deception. Unless it was pointed out to them. Her discovery suggested serious underreporting of spice production to Choam and the Emperor. Either the Harkonnens were selling melange illicitly, doubtful because that could easily be tracked, or accumulating secret stockpiles of their own. Interesting, Margaret thought, raising her eyebrows. She opened her eyes, went over to a reinforced window casement, and stared out at the liquid metal seas, the choppy waves trapped within the bottleneck fjords, the murky black clouds hovering above the rugged bulwarks of rock. In the bleak distance, fur whales set up an eerie, humming song. The following day she booked passage on the next Guild Highliner. Then, shucking her disguise, she rode up in a cargo hauler filled with processed whale fur. She doubted that anyone on Lankavile had noticed her arrival or her departure. 4 things cannot be hidden: love, smoke, a pillar of fire, and a man striding across the open bled. Freeman Wisdom. Alone in the quiet, stark desert. Exactly as it should be. Pardot Kynes found that he worked best with nothing but his own thoughts and plenty of time to think them. Other people provided too many distractions, and few others had the same focus or the same drive. As imperial planetologist to Arrakis, he needed to absorb the huge landscape into every pore of his being. Once he got into the right mindset, he could actually feel the pulse of a world. Now, standing atop a rugged formation of black and red rock that had been uplifted from the surrounding basin, the lean, weathered man stared in both directions at the vastness. Desert. Desert everywhere. His map screen named the mountainous line Rimwall West. His altimeter proclaimed the tallest peaks to be substantially higher than 6,000 meters. Yet he saw no snow, glaciers, or ice, no sign of precipitation whatsoever. Even the most rugged and atomic-blasted mountain tops on Seleucia Secundus had been covered with snow. But the air here was so desperately dry that exposed water could not survive in any form. Kynes stared southward across the ocean of sand to the world-girdling desert known as the Funeral Plain. No doubt geographers could have found ample distinctions to categorize the landscape into further labeled subsections, but few humans who ventured out there ever returned. This was the domain of the worms. No one really needed maps. Bemused, Kynes remembered ancient sailing charts from the earliest days of Old Terra, their mysterious, unexplored areas marked simply, "Here be monsters." Yes, he thought as he recalled Rabban's hunt of the incredible sandworm. Here be monsters indeed. Exposed atop the serrated ridge of the rim wall, he removed the stillsuit's nostril plugs and rubbed a sore spot where the filter constantly brushed against his nose. Then he pulled away the covering on his mouth so he could take a deep breath of the scorched, brittle air. According to his desert prep instructions, he knew he should not expose himself unnecessarily to such water loss, but Kynes needed to draw in the aromas and vibrations of Arrakis, needed to sense the heartbeat of the planet. He smelled hot dust, the subtle saltiness of minerals, the distinct tastes of sand, weathered lava, and basalt. This was a world entirely without the moist scents of either growing or rotting vegetation, without any odor that might betray the cycles of life and death. Only sand and rock and more sand. Upon closer inspection, though, even the harshest desert teemed with life, with specialized plants, with animals and insects adapted to hostile ecological niches. He knelt to scrutinize shadowy pockets in the rock, tiny hollows where the barest breath of morning dew might collect. There, lichens gripped the rough stone surface. A few hard pellets marked the droppings of a small rodent, perhaps a kangaroo rat. A few hard pellets marked the droppings of a small rodent, perhaps a kangaroo rat. Insects might make their homes here at high altitude, along with a bit of wind-blown grass or hardy and solitary weeds. On the vertical cliffs, even bats took shelter and surged out at dusk to hunt night moths and gnats. Occasionally, in the enamel-blue sky, he spotted a dark fleck that must have been a hawk or a carrion bird. For such larger animals, survival must be particularly hard. How then do the freemen survive? He'd seen their dusty forms walking the village streets, but the desert people kept to themselves, went about their business, then vanished. Kynes noticed that the civilized villagers treated them differently, but it wasn't clear whether this came from awe or disdain. Polish comes from the cities, went an old freeman saying, wisdom from the desert. According to a few sparse anthropological notes he had found, the freemen were the remnants of an ancient wandering people, the Zen Sunni, who had been slaves dragged from world to world. After being freed, or perhaps escaping, from their captivity, they had tried to find a home for centuries, but were persecuted everywhere they went. Finally, they'd gone to ground here on Arrakis, and somehow they had thrived. Once, when he'd tried to speak to a freeman woman as she walked past, the woman had fixed him with the gaze of her shockingly blue-within-blue eyes, the whites completely swallowed in the indigo of pure spice addiction. The sight had jolted all questions from his mind, and before Kynes could say anything else to her, the freeman woman had hurried on her way, hugging her tattered brown jubba coat over her stillsuit. Kynes had heard rumors that entire freeman population centers were hidden out in the basins and the rocky buttresses of the shield wall, living off the land, when the land itself provided so little life. How did they do it? Kynes still had much to learn about Arrakis, and he thought the freemen could teach him a great deal, if he could ever find them. In dirty, rough-edged Carthage, the Harkonnens had been reluctant to outfit the unwanted planetologist with extravagant equipment. Scowling at the Padishah Emperor's seal on Kynes's requisition, the supply master had authorized him to take clothes, a still tent, a survival kit, 4 liter-johns of water, some preserved rations, and a battered one-man ornithopter with an extended fuel supply. Those items were enough for a person like Kynes, who was a stranger to luxury. He didn't care about formal trappings and useless niceties. He was much more focused on the problem of understanding Arrakis. After checking the predicted storm patterns and prevailing winds, Kynes lit off in the ornithopter toward the northeast, heading deeper into the mountainous terrain surrounding the polar regions. Because the mid-latitudes were broiling wastelands, most human habitation clustered around the highlands. He piloted the old surplus thopter, listening to the loud hum of its engines and the flutter of movable wings. From the air and all alone, this was the best way to see the vistas below, to get a broad perspective on the geological blemishes and patterns, the colors of rock, the canyons. Through the sand-scratched front windows, he could see dry rills and gorges, the diverging brooms of alluvial fans from ancient floods. Some of the steep canyon walls appeared to have been cut by water abrasion, like a sugar-wire strand sawing through strata. Once, in the distance, shimmering with the ripples of a heat mirage, He thought he saw a sparkling salt-encrusted playa that could easily have been a dried sea bottom. But when he flew in that direction, he couldn't find it. Kynes became convinced that this planet had once held water, a lot of it. The evidence was there for any planetologist to see. But where had it all gone? The amount of ice in the polar caps was insignificant, mined by water merchants and hauled down to the cities, where it was sold at a premium. The caps certainly did not hold enough to explain vanished oceans or dried rivers. Had the native water somehow been destroyed or removed from the planet? Or was it just hiding? Kynes flew on, keeping his eyes open and searching, constantly searching. Diligently compiling his journals, he took notes of every interesting thing he spotted. It would take years to gather enough information for a well-founded treatise, but in the past month he had already transmitted 2 regular progress reports back to the Emperor, just to show he was doing his appointed job. He'd handed these reports to an imperial courier and a guild representative, one in Arakeen, the other in Carthage. But he had no idea if Elrud or his advisors even read them. Kynes found himself lost most of the time. His maps and charts were deplorably incomplete or absolutely wrong, which puzzled him. If Arrakis was the sole source of melange, which therefore made this planet one of the most important in the Imperium, then why was the landscape so poorly charted? If the Spacing Guild would just install a few more high-resolution satellites, much of the problem could be solved. No one seemed to know the answer. For a planetologist's purposes, though, being lost caused little concern. He was an explorer, after all, which required him to wander about with no plan and no destination. Even when his ornithopter began to rattle, he pressed on. The ion propulsion engine was strong, and the battered craft handled reasonably well, even in powerful gusts and updrafts of hot air. He had enough fuel to last him for weeks. Kynes remembered all too well the years he had spent on harsh Seleucia, trying to comprehend the catastrophe that had ruined it centuries before. He had seen ancient pictures, knew how beautiful the former capital world had once been. But in his heart, it would always remain the hellish place it was now. Something epical had happened here on Arrakis, too, but no witnesses or records had survived that ancient disaster. He didn't think it could have been atomic, though that solution might be easy to postulate. The ancient wars before and during the Butlerian Jihad had been devastating, had turned entire solar systems into rubble and dust. No, something different had happened here. More days, more wandering. On a barren, silent ridge halfway around the world, Kynes climbed to the top of another rocky peak. He had landed his thopter on a flat, boulder-strewn saddle, then walked up the slope, picking his way hand over hand with jangling equipment on his back. In the unimaginative fashion of early cartographers, this curving arm of rock that formed a barrier between the Habanya Erg to the east and the great sink of the Cielago Depression to the west had been forever named False Wall West. He determined this would be a good spot to establish a data collection outpost. Feeling the exertion in his thighs and hearing the click-ticking of his overworked stillsuit, Kynes knew he must be perspiring heavily. Even so, his suit absorbed and recycled all of his bodily moisture, and he was in good shape. When he could stand it no longer, he drew a lukewarm sip through the catch tube near his throat, then continued to trudge upward on the rough surface. The best place to conserve water is in your own body, said conventional Freeman wisdom, according to the vendor who had sold him his equipment. He was accustomed to the